Rotting alive until his pores leaked ammonia, his ashes were evicted from a cemetery like worthless trash. Yet this pathetic addict was President John F. Kennedy's own brother-in-law, an aristocratic pimp reportedly running a classified presidential brothel. He is Peter Lawford. What terrifying karma engineered this collapse, and exactly how JFK's favorite Playboy, Peter Lawford, drank away his Hollywood grave. Beside the image of a plastic container holding the remains of a condemned pariah sits the memory of a golden hero receiving the adulation of high society. Just a few decades prior, Peter Lawford was the apex predator of the American elite. He was the quintessential British gentleman of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio system. He possessed a devastating charm, an impeccably tailored tuxedo, and a voice that commanded immediate respect. He was a central, indispensable pillar of the Rat Pack. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin on the stage of the Sands Hotel. He helped define the very concept of mid-century cool for an entire generation. More critically, he was the brother-in-law to John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. Lawford was the golden bridge connecting the neon-lit, mob-run vices of Las Vegas with the mahogany halls and nuclear codes of Washington, D.C. He was a man who held the secrets of the most powerful men in the world. Yet when the bill came due for a simple marble plaque, the silence from his billionaire friends and his political dynasty in-laws was deafening. The Kennedy machine remained silent, and Sinatra's Rolodex stayed shut. The world simply let him be thrown out like yesterday's trash. What could possibly push an aristocrat born with a silver spoon, standing at the absolute zenith of American fame, into the deepest, most humiliating abyss of brutal self-destruction? This eviction at Westwood Village was the perfect, terrifying metaphor for his entire existence. Peter Lawford spent his life renting space in the Kennedy family's political dynasty, on Frank Sinatra's Vegas stage, and in the Hollywood studio system. He never owned his power. And when you rent your entire identity from ruthless landlords, the eviction notice is always inevitable. The root of this terrifying void did not begin in the blinding lights of a Hollywood premiere, nor in the smoke-filled rooms of the Kennedy White House. The blueprint for his self-destruction was drawn decades earlier on the damp, gray streets of London. The year is 1923. The location is London. He was born into a suffocating high society scandal rather than a traditional British home. His mother, May Aylen, was already married to another military officer when she became pregnant. The biological father was Lieutenant General Sir Sidney Turing Barlow Lawford, a highly decorated, terrifyingly stern hero of the First World War. When the affair was exposed, the societal fallout was absolute. The scandal forced his parents into a hasty marriage and essentially exiled them from the polite drawing rooms of London. Consequently, Peter did not grow up as a normal English boy. He grew up as a wealthy refugee. His childhood was spent drifting through the opulent, emotionally barren hotels of the French Riviera. Many biographers point out that he never experienced the grounding reality of a public school. There were no playground fistfights. There were no childhood friendships to help him build a normal, resilient ego. There were only private tutors, rigid etiquette lessons, and the overwhelming expectations of two deeply narcissistic parents. His father, the decorated general, viewed him less as a son and more as a subordinate, constantly failing military inspection. His mother treated him like a living accessory. He was a pedigreed lapdog to be dressed in pristine suits and paraded in front of wealthy guests. It was in these claustrophobic, velvet-lined hotel rooms that Peter Lawford developed his fatal psychological weakness. He learned at a cellular level that his value was entirely conditional. He was only loved when he was charming. He was only tolerated when he was entertaining. He had no internal sense of self-worth. His identity became entirely dependent on reading the room and becoming exactly what the most intimidating adult in that room demanded. This was the birth of the ultimate people pleaser. He was a boy meticulously trained to swallow his own feelings and reflect the desires of others. Then came the physical trauma that cemented his psychological ruin. The year is around 1937. Peter is 14 years old, living in France. While running, he accidentally trips and thrusts his right arm straight through a heavy glass door. The vivid reality of this moment is gruesome. The shattered glass sliced through his flesh, severely severing nerves and muscles. The injury was catastrophic. He permanently lost the full use and full mobility of his right hand and forearm. For a boy whose entire worth was based on physical perfection, this was a devastating blow. But the true cost of that shattered glass was not paid until a few years later. When the Second World War erupted, the young men of his aristocratic class went off to fight. They bled and died for their country. Peter Lawford, due to his withered arm, was medically disqualified, while his peers were forged in the fires of combat, earning genuine respect and building authentic brotherhoods. Peter was sidelined. He was consumed by a crippling, silent survivor's guilt. He felt like a coward. He felt like an imposter playing at being a man. To escape the war in Europe, his mother brought him to the one place on earth that specialized in manufacturing imposters. They moved to Hollywood. By the early 1940s, the Lawfords were struggling financially in California. The general's military pension was simply not enough to maintain their lavish aristocratic lifestyle. But Peter had a face that the camera loved. A talent scout spotted the handsome, impeccably polite young man. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the most powerful movie studio in the world, swallowed him whole. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrannical head of MGM, did not sign Peter Lawford because he was a brilliant, classically trained actor. He signed him because he was a piece of authentic British aristocracy that could be packaged and sold to middle America. The studio system took this fragile, eager-to-please, deeply insecure young man. They gave him the one thing he had always craved, a script for his life. Rather than teaching him the craft of acting, the studio weaponized his upbringing, training him simply to behave. They capitalized on his refined accent, his aristocratic cheekbones, and his desperate eagerness to follow directions. He was cast in a relentless string of lightweight comedies and romantic dramas. He played the dashing boy next door, the gallant soldier, the perfect gentleman. Films like The White Cliffs of Dover and Good News solidified his image. On screen, he was confident, wealthy, and irresistible. He was starring alongside giants like Elizabeth Taylor and Frank Sinatra. Yet, beneath the gloss of the movie posters, the physical reality on the soundstage told a different story. The gap between the confident playboy the public saw and the terrified boy inside was massive. The friction between those two identities was starting to generate a dangerous amount of heat. Lawford was perpetually terrified of being exposed as a fraud. He knew he wasn't a real soldier. He just wore the uniform in movies, hiding his crippled arm from the camera angles. He knew he wasn't a real leading man. He was just a handsome prop hired to make the leading ladies look good. To manage the crushing anxiety of this daily performance, he found a chemical solution. This is when the drinking shifted. It was no longer the polite, social drinking of a wealthy young aristocrat at a dinner party. It became purely medicinal. The physical manifestations of his fear soon became impossible to hide. Co-workers from that era began to notice it. He started requiring a stiff drink just to walk onto the set. He needed the alcohol to steady the physical tremors of his damaged right arm and to calm the psychological tremors of his racing heart. He was establishing a devastating chemical dependency that would eventually destroy his own body. The issue wasn't that he enjoyed a cocktail. The issue was that he was using alcohol as a synthetic spine. He was trying to medicate away his profound sense of inadequacy. Up to this point, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, everything still appears to be a glittering success. He is rich, he is famous, and he is undeniably beautiful. He is living the absolute peak of the American dream. But the psychological architecture is completely hollow. MGM had built a magnificent towering facade with absolutely no foundation. Lawford was a king with no country. He had the money, he had the look, but he was still searching for an alpha force to validate his existence. He was desperately looking for a power structure he could submit to in exchange for a feeling of safety. He was a perfect, compliant vessel waiting to be filled. He thought Hollywood was the pinnacle of influence. He had no idea that a much darker, much more demanding syndicate was about to acquire him. In 1954, that empty vessel was hijacked by the most ruthless, glamorous political dynasty in American history. And this is where things really get dirty. The year is 1954, and Peter Lawford was about to make a decision that would alter the course of his life. Still searching for a structure to ground his deep-seated insecurities, he found what appeared to be a sanctuary in Patricia Kennedy. However, he was about to mistake a political alliance for a family homecoming. She was the striking, fiercely intelligent daughter of the most ambitious political dynasty in the United States. To the outside world, their courtship looked like a mid-century fairy tale. It was the ultimate blending of American mythologies. The glamorous, sun-drenched royalty of Hollywood merging with the powerful old money aristocracy of the East Coast. But if you look beneath the glossy magazine covers, the psychological reality of this union was profoundly dark. It was a collision of two fatal flaws. Patricia Kennedy was a woman trapped in a patriarchal empire. In the Kennedy family, the sons were bred to conquer the world, and the daughters were expected to support them. Patricia was fascinated by the glitz and rebellion of the entertainment industry. Marrying an actor was her controlled rebellion against the suffocating expectations of her bloodline. Peter, on the other hand, was not rebelling against anything. He was surrendering. He looked at the massive, intimidating Kennedy clan and saw the ultimate alpha structure. He saw a fortress that could finally protect him from his own paralyzing insecurities. He desperately wanted a father figure to validate him, and he looked toward the patriarch of the family, Joseph P. Kennedy. But Joseph P. Kennedy was not a man who dealt in fatherly affection. He was an apex predator of American capitalism and politics. He viewed human beings entirely through the cold, unforgiving lens of utility. Every handshake, every alliance, and every marriage was evaluated based on a single criterion. How will this help put my sons in the White House? When Patricia brought Peter Lawford home, the patriarch did not see a beloved new son. He saw a highly recognizable, impeccably dressed public relations asset. It is a chilling, often overlooked historical fact that Joseph Kennedy himself had a deep, ruthless history in Hollywood. During the 1920s, he had ruthlessly navigated the studio system, running RKO Pictures and engaging in a highly publicized affair with screen legend Gloria Swanson. The patriarch knew exactly how the movie business worked. More importantly, he knew exactly what actors were. He knew they were fragile, constructed illusions, entirely dependent on public approval. He approved the marriage not out of sentimental warmth, but because he calculated the exact political value of Peter Lawford's famous face. The actor was a shiny hood ornament that could make the gritty, ruthless Kennedy political machine look sophisticated, modern, and accessible to the American voter. The wedding took place in April 1954 in New York City. The streets outside the church were mobbed with thousands of screaming fans. Inside the Catholic sanctuary, surrounded by senators, millionaires, and movie stars, Peter Lawford thought he had finally won. He thought he had crossed the moat and entered an impenetrable fortress. He believed the Kennedy name was a shield that would protect him from his fading box office numbers and his own self-hatred. But the Kennedy family was not a sanctuary. It was a brutal, hyper-competitive proving ground. In that family, love was not a given right. It was a daily wage that had to be earned through relentless, high-stakes performance. If you stopped producing value, you simply ceased to exist in their eyes. The vivid physical reality of Lawford's everyday existence was fully exposed at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, during the late 1950s. The family culture was defined by aggressive, relentless physical competition. They played vicious games of touch football on the sweeping front lawns. They sailed in treacherous weather. They debated global politics at the dinner table with the ferocity of gladiators. Place Peter Lawford in the middle of this environment. Remember the shattered glass door in France. Remember his crippled, withered right arm, permanently damaged and weak. Lawford was thrust into a family of robust, fiercely athletic alpha males, and he was physically incapable of competing. But his fatal weakness, his pathological need to please, meant he could not excuse himself. He could not show weakness. So, he ran on the lawn with them. Press photographers clicked furiously from the perimeter, while Lawford, with a terrifying, bright smile plastered across his face, desperately tried to catch a football. Sweat is pooling on his brow. He is desperately trying to catch a football with a damaged hand, terrified of dropping it in front of Joseph Kennedy and his ambitious brother-in-law, John. He is acting the role of the athletic, carefree family man, while inside his nervous system is screaming in panic. To survive the sheer psychological terror of these weekends, his medicinal drinking escalated drastically. The polished British gentleman would quietly excuse himself to the mahogany bathrooms of the Hyannisport estate. Behind a locked door, he would pull a silver flask from his tailored trousers and take long, desperate swallows of hard liquor. He needed the alcohol simply to stop his hands from shaking before he walked back out to face his in-laws. He was constructing a daily chemical scaffolding just to keep his fragile ego from collapsing under the weight of the Kennedy expectations. And the humiliation did not stop on the football field. It extended into the dining room. It was an unspoken but rigidly enforced rule within the family dynamic that Peter Lawford was not a serious man. During the intense high-level political debates that dominated the Kennedy dinner table, Peter was implicitly expected to remain silent. He was not there to offer opinions on the Cold War or domestic policy. He was there to be the court jester. When the heavy political talk subsided, he was expected to perform. He was prompted to tell amusing anecdotes about Clark Gable, Judy Garland, and the scandals of the MGM backlots. He was the entertainment. He swallowed this profound indignity with a charming smile. He accepted his role as the lightweight mascot because the overwhelming fear of being cast out of the dynasty was far worse than the quiet degradation of being silenced. He willingly liquidated his intellectual dignity to maintain his seat at the table. He was a man who had entirely given up the right to his own voice. As the 1950s progressed and John F. Kennedy's political star began its aggressive ascent toward the presidency, Lawford's role shifted. He was no longer just the amusing son-in-law. The patriarch, Joseph Kennedy, activated him. Lawford was assigned a specific, highly dangerous utility. He became the official Hollywood ambassador for the Kennedy campaign. His job was to bridge the gap between Washington and Los Angeles. He was tasked with organizing massive, star-studded fundraisers. He had to convince the wealthiest, most influential figures in the entertainment industry to open their checkbooks for his brother-in-law. For a brief, intoxicating period, Lawford felt like a kingmaker. His sprawling beachfront mansion in Santa Monica became the glittering West Coast headquarters for the Kennedy operation. The driveway was packed with Rolls-Royces. The living room was filled with studio executives, famous directors, and beautiful women. Lawford was the man holding the door open. He was the gatekeeper to the future president of the United States. But this was the ultimate illusion. He was completely confusing proximity to power with the possession of power. He thought he was accumulating influence. In reality, he was accumulating massive psychological and moral debt. He was running a dangerous deficit, spending emotional energy he did not have to impress political titans who were fundamentally unimpressible. He was making promises he could not keep. He was leveraging friendships that were as fragile as spun glass. He was acting as the middleman in a transaction where he held absolutely none of the capital. Up to this point, heading into the final years of the 1950s, Peter Lawford was merely an elegant political ornament. He was playing a stressful, exhausting game, but he was still operating within the relatively safe, polite bounds of American high society. The Kennedys, with all their ruthlessness, were only the political wing of his new existence. He had not yet met the other half of the equation that would seal his doom. He had yet to be summoned by a completely different, much darker kind of monarchy. Because while he was busy proving his worth to the politicians in the East, a new emperor was rising in the neon deserts of the West. And when Frank Sinatra opened the heavily guarded doors to the Las Vegas underworld, Lawford would happily, eagerly walk inside, flashing his $1 million smile, completely unaware that he was stepping directly onto his own scaffold. If the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport was the terrifying sunlit proving ground where Peter Lawford was forced to earn his daily bread, then Las Vegas in the late 1950s was the neon-lit underworld where he went to spend it. The sheer magnitude of Lawford's trap becomes glaringly apparent when examining the second absolute monarchy to which he surrendered his soul. While John F. Kennedy was meticulously climbing the political ladder on the East Coast, Frank Sinatra was establishing himself as the undisputed emperor of the West. And Frank Sinatra, much like the patriarch Joseph Kennedy, was a man who did not understand the concept of friendship. He only understood the concept of leverage. By 1959, the Rat Pack was not just an entertainment act, it was a cultural cartel. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Joey Bishop commanded a level of social and economic power that was unprecedented in American show business. They owned the stage at the Sands Hotel, they dictated the terms to the studios, and they operated with total staggering impunity. Sinatra was the undisputed alpha, a man deeply obsessed with dominance, loyalty, and his own mythology. But for all his millions, his private jets, and his mafia connections, Sinatra lacked one crucial, elusive prize. He lacked legitimate institutional political power. He wanted to be a kingmaker. He wanted to walk through the front doors of the White House, not the servant's entrance. And right there, standing in his impeccably tailored tuxedo, desperately eager to please, was Peter Lawford. Sinatra acquired Lawford not for vocal talent or intoxicating cool, but as a highly useful piece of human currency. Lawford was the golden key. He was the direct, unmonitored back channel to the rising star of the Democratic Party. Through Lawford, Sinatra could whisper in the ear of the man who might soon control the United States government. For Lawford, the transaction seemed like the ultimate salvation. If the Kennedys made him feel small, inadequate, and intellectually inferior, the Rat Pack offered an entirely different kind of validation. They offered him the intoxicating illusion of danger. They let him sit at the table with the coolest, most feared men on earth for a boy who grew up isolated in French hotel rooms, crippled by insecurity and a desperate need to belong. Being inducted into the ultimate boys' club was a narcotic far more powerful than any alcohol. He happily handed over his political connections in exchange for a seat at the bar. But the physical reality of how he paid for that seat in the Copa room at the Sands Hotel was deeply humiliating. On the Sands Hotel stage in 1960, the room was thick with cigarette smoke and the clinking of heavy crystal glasses. The audience is packed with high rollers, celebrities, and made men from the Chicago outfit. Sinatra and Martin are completely in their element, casually pushing a liquor cart across the stage, improvising a masterclass in mid-century arrogance. And then there is Lawford. He is standing slightly off to the side. Relegated to the shadows of the stage, he was stripped of soaring solos and sharp dialogue. Instead, he became the joke himself. Sinatra, exercising his power through public degradation, made Lawford the designated whipping boy of the act. The jokes were relentless, highly personal, and deeply cruel. They openly mocked his British accent, portraying him as a weak, effete aristocrat among real red-blooded men. They mercilessly mocked his acting abilities, suggesting he was a talentless hack who only had a job because of his in-laws. Sinatra publicly coined the nickname Brother in Lawford, effectively stripping Peter of his own identity and reducing his entire existence to his marital status. Archival footage of those performances reveals a terrifying gap between his internal reality and his external facade. He is standing in the spotlight, a drink clutched tightly in his damaged right hand. Sinatra delivers a vicious, emasculating joke about Lawford's lack of masculinity. And what does Lawford do? He laughs. He throws his head back and unleashes a loud, eager, desperate laugh. He breaks into a sweat, his eyes darting frantically to Sinatra for a sign of approval. He is performing his own humiliation, participating in his own public execution, because the psychological terror of being kicked off that stage was a fate worse than death. To Lawford's broken, trauma-wired brain, being mocked by Frank Sinatra was proof that Frank Sinatra knew he existed. It was a deeply toxic, abusive form of validation. If Sinatra was taking the time to publicly tear him down, it meant he was important enough to be destroyed. He surrendered his dignity night after night, swallowing the insults like bitter pills, because he fundamentally believed he deserved them. He was a man who had entirely given up the right to his own respect. The psychological toll of living this dual existence, being the quiet, polite Kennedy mascot by day and the sweaty, humiliated Rat Pack punching bag by night, required a staggering amount of chemical reinforcement. The polite nips from the silver flask in Hyannisport were no longer sufficient. Lawford was now operating in a world that did not sleep. Sinatra was legendary for his insomnia and his tyrannical demand that his inner circle stay awake with him, drinking until the sun came up over the Nevada desert. If you went to sleep before Frank, you were out. To keep his eyes open to match the grueling, psychotic stamina of the titans around him, Lawford fully embraced cocaine. The drug was the perfect, fatal solution for a man terrified of his own weakness. It provided a false synthetic spine. It gave him an artificial surge of confidence, allowing him to stand in a room full of mobsters and politicians and believe for a fleeting hour that he was their equal. The elegant British actor of the MGM days was rapidly mutating into a hyperactive, twitchy concierge. His jaw was perpetually clenched. His eyes were bloodshot, often hidden behind dark sunglasses, even indoors. His hands, already unsteady from his childhood injury, now vibrated with a constant chemical hum. And the danger he was exposing himself to was no longer just psychological. It was lethally physical. The men drinking at Sinatra's private tables after the show were not studio executives. They were men like Sam Giancana, the brutal, terrifying boss of the Chicago Mafia. Lawford, fueled by cocaine and a desperate desire to play the tough guy, rubbed shoulders with men who murdered people for a living. He thought he was part of the gang. He was playing a very dangerous game of dress-up with men who did not play games. By the time the 1960 presidential election arrived, Lawford had successfully woven a catastrophic web. He had become the ultimate, indispensable bridge. He convinced Sinatra to pour massive amounts of money, influence, and mob-backed union support into the Kennedy campaign. He orchestrated the famous star-studded fundraising galas, leveraging his Hollywood Rolodex to bankroll his brother-in-law's ambition. He was the golden wire connecting the United States government on one side and the Las Vegas syndicate on the other. He had constructed a massive ticking bomb. He had placed the President of the United States in bed with the American mafia, and he had foolishly positioned his own fragile, chemically dependent body right at ground zero. He thought his ability to please both sides made him powerful. He did not understand that when you act as the bridge between two ruthless, warring empires, you are destined to be trampled the moment the armies decide to march. And this exact bridge, the opulent beachfront mansion in Santa Monica, where the secrets of the world were brokered, was about to become the site of the most catastrophic explosion of his life. Because you cannot serve two ruthless kings forever without one of them demanding your head. If you want to witness the exact location where Peter Lawford willingly traded the last remnants of his soul for a seat at the table of power, you do not look at a movie set. You look at a specific piece of California real estate. The address was 625 Palisades Beach Road, an opulent, sprawling mansion sitting directly on the golden sands of Santa Monica. To the tourists driving down the Pacific Coast Highway in the early 1960s, it looked like the ultimate Hollywood dream home, the perfect sanctuary for a handsome movie star and his beautiful Kennedy wife. But if you look at the historical architecture of what actually occurred behind those heavily guarded mahogany doors, a very different picture emerges. This house was not a home, it was an embassy of vice. It was a clandestine, high-security transaction room where the rigid, moralistic laws of the United States government and the terrifying, violent rules of the Las Vegas underworld were simultaneously suspended. When John F. Kennedy won the presidency in 1960, the dynamic between the two brothers-in-law fundamentally shifted. JFK was no longer just an ambitious senator. He was the commander-in-chief. He was a man operating under the crushing, unimaginable pressure of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the daily threat of nuclear annihilation. But he was also a man possessed of legendary reckless appetites. He required an outlet. He needed a place where the prying eyes of the Washington press corps could not reach, and where the intense scrutiny of his father and his brother Robert could be temporarily blinded. He needed a safe house. And Peter Lawford, desperate to prove his indispensable worth to the crown, eagerly handed over his keys. Lawford did not use his home to host intellectual salons or shape domestic policy. He weaponized his own living room to become the ultimate political fixer. He transformed his sanctuary into a glorified, highly classified brothel for the American elite. Sneaking the most famous, heavily guarded man on the planet out of the White House and into a beachfront party was not a casual undertaking. Managing such clandestine operations required military precision. When the president flew into Los Angeles, the Secret Service would descend upon the Santa Monica property. They would sweep the perimeter, lock down the beach, and secure the phone lines. And right in the middle of this intense, high-stakes security apparatus stood Peter Lawford, sweating through his custom-tailored silk shirts, acting as the nervous, twitchy concierge. His job was to curate the guest list. He was tasked with providing the entertainment, which in this specific context meant ensuring a steady supply of aspiring starlets, models, and Hollywood royalty willing to engage with the commander-in-chief. Lawford was making the phone calls. He was arranging the private cars to bring the women through the heavily guarded back gates. He was pouring the drinks, dimming the lights, and then quietly, obediently, excusing himself from his own master bedroom so the president could have his privacy. This is the vivid, pathetic reality of his existence. He was a man who had entirely surrendered the sovereignty of his own home. He was the least powerful person in his own house. And then there was the most explosive, dangerous secret of all. It is the secret that would eventually burn through the floorboards of the Santa Monica house and leave a permanent stain on American history. Many historians point out that Peter Lawford was the primary architect and facilitator of the clandestine relationship between President Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. Look at the monstrous, agonizing contradiction of this specific arrangement. Marilyn Monroe was the most famous woman in the world, a fragile, deeply troubled icon battling her own severe addictions and psychological demons. Lawford, who was himself crumbling under the weight of his insecurities and his cocaine habit, was put in charge of managing her. He was tasked with flying her in, keeping her calm, and coordinating her private encounters with the president. Some historical records suggest he even facilitated meetings between Monroe and the president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, in that very same house. He was holding a lit match over a powder keg of unprecedented proportions. If any single detail of these arrangements leaked to the press, the Kennedy presidency would be instantly destroyed. The geopolitical fallout would be catastrophic. The mobsters who helped fund the election would demand retribution. And who would be the fall guy? Who would be the convenient, disposable target for everyone's rage? It would not be the president. It would be the actor. The physical toll of carrying this burden was absolute. Lawford's body became a visual roadmap of his panic. You do not hold the dirtiest secrets of the free world without paying a biological tax. His insomnia became absolute. He could no longer sleep for more than a few hours at a time. The ringing of a telephone in the middle of the night would send his heart rate skyrocketing, terrified that it was a reporter, a mob boss, or a furious Kennedy operative on the other end of the line. To manage this suffocating 24-hour paranoia, his reliance on narcotics evolved from a recreational habit into a brutal, necessary survival mechanism. Cocaine was no longer just something he did to keep up with Frank Sinatra in Vegas. It became his daily fuel. The powder provided an artificial chemical arrogance, a temporary illusion that he was a master manipulator controlling the chessboard. But observe the physical manifestations. His jaw was locked in a perpetual nervous grind. His weight began to plummet. His hands shook so violently that he often had to hold his drink with both hands just to bring the glass to his lips. He was bleeding out internally, his nervous system completely frayed by the sheer terror of his daily reality. And yet, despite the crushing anxiety, he refused to stop. This is the core of his fatal weakness. The addiction to the proximity of power was far stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. He loved the intoxicating thrill of answering a private phone line and hearing the president's voice on the other end. He loved the terrifying rush of standing in a room with Chicago mafia bosses and knowing they needed him to pass a message to Washington. He genuinely believed that because he knew everyone's secrets, he was untouchable. He believed he was the indispensable man. He failed to understand a fundamental law of power dynamics. The man who knows where all the bodies are buried is usually the next one to go in the ground. He thought he was a kingmaker orchestrating a grand historical symphony from his beachfront patio. In reality, he was a hostage suffering from a terminal case of Stockholm Syndrome. He had handed the detonator of his life over to men who did not care if he lived or died. He was desperately juggling flaming torches, smiling for the cameras, terrified to drop even a single one. Up to this point, heading into the early months of 1962, everything is still miraculously holding together. The terrifying balancing act is working. JFK is safely in the Oval Office, managing the world. Sinatra is reigning over the Sands Hotel, raking in millions, and Peter Lawford is the vital pulsing artery connecting the two empires. He is exhausted, he is chemically dependent, and he is deeply miserable, but he is still functioning. But a bridge built entirely on compromised morals, cocaine, and political leverage cannot withstand a sudden violent shift in the tectonic plates. Lawford believed that because he was loyal to both the president and the Emperor of Las Vegas, they would both protect him. He never stopped to ask himself a terrifying question. What happens when the president and the emperor go to war with each other? That exact scenario was about to unfold. The illusion of control was about to be shattered in the most spectacular, humiliating fashion imaginable. A simple change of travel plans, a few lines in an FBI dossier, and a dispute over a concrete helipad in the desert were about to trigger a chain reaction that would strip Peter Lawford of every single thing he held dear. The two massive pillars of his existence were on a direct, unavoidable collision course, and Peter Lawford was standing exactly at the point of impact. The year is 1962, and the fragile, chemically sustained illusion that Peter Lawford had constructed was about to be pulverized by the very forces he thought he controlled. Up to this point, Lawford genuinely believed he was a master diplomat. He had successfully convinced himself that he was the indispensable hinge upon which two massive American empires swung. On the East Coast, he was the beloved Hollywood ambassador for the President of the United States. On the West Coast, he was the aristocratic wingman for the undisputed Emperor of Las Vegas. But Lawford failed to comprehend a terrifying fundamental law of power dynamics. When you act as a human bridge between two ruthless, narcissistic kings, your survival depends entirely on their continued alliance. If those two kings decide to go to war, the bridge is the first thing that gets destroyed. The catalyst for this destruction was a highly publicized, deeply symbolic presidential trip to California, scheduled for March of 1962. John F. Kennedy was coming to the West Coast, and Frank Sinatra viewed this visit not merely as an honor, but as his ultimate coronation. For Sinatra, proximity to the presidency was the holy grail. It was the one currency that could permanently buy his way out of the shadowy, mob-tainted underworld and into the pristine, untouchable pages of the historical record. He demanded to host the president at his sprawling, heavily guarded compound in Palm Springs. And Peter Lawford, eager to please his alpha male and desperate to maintain his own value, enthusiastically brokered the arrangement. The sheer arrogance of the preparations magnified the inevitable fall. Sinatra went into a frenzy of obsessive, megalomaniacal construction. He essentially built a sovereign presidential state in the middle of the desert. He spent a fortune upgrading the compound. He installed specialized, highly secure communication lines directly linking the desert estate to the White House and the Pentagon. He constructed massive cottages to house the Secret Service detail. Most famously, and most tragically, he poured a massive concrete helipad right in the middle of his property, specifically designed to accommodate the heavy presidential helicopters. Sinatra was preparing to host the leader of the free world, and he wanted everyone in the Hollywood syndicate to know it. And Lawford was riding the crest of this manic wave. He was the man who had delivered the prize. He walked around the Palm Springs estate, a glass of scotch in his trembling, damaged hand, high on cocaine and the intoxicating fumes of borrowed power. He thought he had finally secured his permanent seat at the table. He thought he was untouchable, but 3,000 miles away, in the cold, unfeeling, bureaucratic architecture of Washington, D.C., a different kind of power was being exercised. The Department of Justice was not interested in Hollywood royalty. The Department of Justice was run by the president's younger brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy was a man of absolute, uncompromising ruthlessness. He had launched an aggressive, highly publicized war against organized crime, and he viewed the glamorous, morally ambiguous world of his brother-in-law with thinly veiled contempt. Bobby Kennedy had access to the FBI dossiers compiled by J. Edgar Hoover. These files contained undeniable, heavily documented evidence of Frank Sinatra's deep, ongoing ties to the Chicago outfit, specifically his relationship with the brutal mafia boss Sam Giancana. For the Attorney General, the equation was brutally simple. It was a matter of national security and political survival. The optics of the President of the United States sleeping under the roof of a man closely associated with the American Mafia was a political death sentence. It was a catastrophic vulnerability. Bobby Kennedy walked into the Oval Office and delivered an absolute, non-negotiable ultimatum to his brother. The president could not, under any circumstances, stay at the Palm Springs compound. The trip had to be canceled. The President of the United States did not pick up the telephone and call Frank Sinatra to apologize. JFK, a man notoriously averse to direct, uncomfortable personal confrontation, used his brother-in-law as a human shield. He instructed Peter Lawford to deliver the news. He commanded Lawford to call the most volatile, dangerous entertainer in America and tell him that the president was rejecting his hospitality. Imagine the sheer, paralyzing terror of that moment. Lawford was trapped. He could not disobey the president, the man who provided his political legitimacy. But he knew that delivering this insult to Sinatra would result in his own annihilation. His fatal psychological weakness, his desperate need to keep everyone happy, had finally backed him into an inescapable corner. Sweating profusely, his heart racing with a cocaine-fueled panic, Lawford picked up the phone and dialed the Palm Springs compound. He stumbled through the pathetic, transparent excuses. He blamed security concerns. He blamed logistics. But Sinatra was not a fool. He knew exactly what was happening. And the narcissistic injury he suffered was catastrophic. The rejection was profound, but the President of the United States added a final spectacular insult to the wound. JFK did not just cancel his stay at Sinatra's house. He chose to stay at the nearby estate of Bing Crosby. Crosby was not just a fellow entertainer. He was an outspoken conservative Republican, and he was Sinatra's most prominent rival. The president had publicly chosen a Republican rival over the Emperor of the Rat Pack. The explosion in Palm Springs was biblical in its fury. Sinatra did not simply get angry, he went temporarily insane. He physically attacked his own property. Witnesses described him taking a sledgehammer and violently, furiously smashing the newly poured concrete of the presidential helipad. He tore out the secure phone lines. He destroyed the very architecture of his own ambition. But a man with an ego the size of Frank Sinatra's cannot consciously blame the President of the United States for his humiliation. The human mind must displace that kind of rage to survive. Sinatra needed a scapegoat. He needed a conduit for his blinding fury. He turned his absolute terrifying wrath onto the messenger. He turned on Peter Lawford. With one phone call, Sinatra executed Lawford. The excommunication was immediate, total, and completely merciless. Sinatra banished him from the Rat Pack. But it did not stop with a severed friendship. Sinatra weaponized his massive economic and social power to completely erase Lawford from the entertainment industry. Upcoming film roles that Lawford had secured through Sinatra's production company were immediately recast. Lawford was blacklisted from the Las Vegas syndicate. If Sinatra was performing, Lawford was not allowed in the building. The vivid physical reality of this erasure was absolute. To be banned by Frank Sinatra in 1962 meant becoming a ghost while still breathing. Lawford would walk into exclusive restaurants in Los Angeles, places where he used to be greeted like royalty, and the maitre d' would suddenly claim there were no tables available. Studio executives who used to drink his liquor and swim in his pool suddenly refused to return his phone calls. Fellow actors physically turned their backs on him at parties. The mafia associates he had eagerly rubbed shoulders with now looked right through him. He was violently ejected from the inner circle and thrown out into the freezing cold. The midpoint peak of his life had arrived. The illusion was shattered. The psychological toll of this banishment was devastating. Lawford's entire identity was predicated on his inclusion in that group. Without Sinatra to validate him, without the dangerous thrill of the Las Vegas underworld to mask his own insecurities, Lawford was forced to face the terrifying void inside himself. His response was exactly what you would expect from a man with no internal foundation. He drastically increased his chemical intake. The alcohol consumption became chronic. The cocaine use escalated from a party habit to a desperate, frantic medication. He was trying to chemically numb the overwhelming shame of being publicly discarded by the alpha male he worshipped. Yet, in his chemically altered, desperate state, Lawford found a twisted mechanism for hope. He rationalized the catastrophe. He convinced himself that he had sacrificed his Hollywood standing for the noble cause of protecting the presidency. He believed that he had taken a bullet for the Kennedys. He retreated heavily into the political dynasty, clinging to his marriage to Patricia with a suffocating desperation. He thought, I may have lost Vegas, but I still have the White House. He genuinely believed that as long as John F. Kennedy sat in the Oval Office, he still possessed a shield against the world. He thought the Kennedy machine would reward his loyalty and protect him from his rapidly declining career. He walked around his Santa Monica mansion, the house that was now ominously quiet without the Rat Pack parties, telling himself that he was still a kingmaker. He was entirely blissfully unaware that the geopolitical clock was ticking down to a bright November day in Texas. He had absolutely no idea that in just over a year, the second final pillar of his existence would be violently, bloodily ripped away from him, leaving him standing in the smoking ruins of his life with absolutely nothing left to protect him from himself. When the bullet struck the president's motorcade in the blinding, unforgiving sunlight, of Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963, they did more than shatter the soul of a nation. They fundamentally, violently severed Peter Lawford's final life support system. Up until that Friday afternoon, Lawford had managed to survive his humiliating expulsion from Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack by hiding behind the ultimate political shield. He had rationalized his banishment. He had convinced himself that he was a martyr for the crown. He believed that his marriage to Patricia Kennedy granted him a permanent, unbreakable form of diplomatic immunity. He thought he was a made man in the American political mafia, safely tucked inside the walls of Camelot. But this was the fatal delusion of a man who never understood the true, cold-blooded nature of the power he worshipped. Power, especially the generational dynastic power of the Kennedy family, is ruthlessly unsentimental. When John F. Kennedy died, Peter Lawford's political and social utility died instantly with him. You must look at the mechanical, terrifying precision of a political machine purging a liability in real time. This is how power is exercised when it is threatened. In the immediate grief-stricken aftermath of the assassination, the Kennedy family aggressively circled the wagons. The surviving patriarch of the family's political ambition was now Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy did not view Peter Lawford as a grieving brother-in-law. He viewed him as a massive walking national security risk. The glamorous, frivolous Hollywood annex of the family, the beachfront parties, the movie star liaisons, the mob connections that Lawford had managed, was no longer seen as a useful public relations asset. It was a dangerous, dirty secret that needed to be buried immediately alongside the president. Bobby Kennedy, who had always viewed his actor brother-in-law with thinly veiled contempt, initiated a silent but absolute freeze-out. The execution was bloodless, but entirely lethal. Lawford went from being the ultimate White House insider to a complete outcast literally overnight. He was not invited to the private, high-level family strategy meetings following the funeral. His panicked phone calls to the East Coast were met with polite, icy deflections by secretaries who had once eagerly transferred him directly to the Oval Office. He was left standing on the outside of the Camelot myth he had helped build, watching the heavy drawbridge pull up without him. The physical reality of this isolation was staggering. You have to picture the sprawling beachfront mansion in Santa Monica. Just months prior, this house was buzzing with Secret Service agents, ringing telephones and the most famous faces on Earth. It was the epicenter of West Coast power. Now, in the winter of 1964, it was dead quiet. The silence in that massive house must have been deafening to a man whose entire psychological survival depended on the noise of other people's approval. The driveway was empty. The secure phone lines had been disconnected. Without Sinatra to tell him he was cool, and without Jack Kennedy to tell him he was important, Lawford was forced to look at himself in the mirror. And what he saw was a terrified, aging actor with a crippled arm, a failing career, and a monstrous, unfeedable addiction. The stress fracture in his marriage rapidly widened into an unbridgeable canyon. Patricia Kennedy, grieving the brutal murder of her brother and exhausted by years of turning a blind eye to Lawford's infidelities, his chaotic lifestyle, and his escalating drug use, finally snapped. Without the unifying force of the president to hold the family optics together, there was no longer any political or social reason to maintain the exhausting facade of a happy Hollywood marriage. In early 1966, she formally filed for divorce. The legal and social execution of Peter Lawford by the Kennedy machine was a masterclass in total destruction. They didn't just divorce him, they surgically extracted him from the historical record. The family lawyers, armed with the unlimited resources of the Kennedy Trust, ensured that he walked away with a mere fraction of what he believed he was owed. They protected the dynasty's wealth with ironclad, merciless ferocity. But the financial blow, devastating as it was absolutely nothing compared to the social decapitation. In the high society circles of New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, an unwritten but heavily enforced decree was issued. To associate with Peter Lawford was to offend the Kennedys. And in 1966, nobody with any ambition, political aspiration, or basic survival instinct wanted to offend the Kennedys. His social calendar evaporated. The invitations to the exclusive galas, the yacht parties, the private political fundraisers, they simply stopped arriving in the mail. He was now excommunicated by Frank Sinatra and the Kennedy family. The two most powerful vindictive syndicates in America had blacklisted him. He was a man completely without a country. This is the exact moment the true grotesque tragedy of Peter Lawford takes root. The loss of his twin pillars, the mob-backed entertainment royalty and the political dynasty, triggered a catastrophic psychological collapse. His fatal weakness, that desperate fawning need for external validation, did not magically disappear just because the kings had abandoned him. It mutated into something pathetic and deeply dangerous. Starved of the high-tier approval he craved from presidents and mob bosses, he began to seek it from the absolute bottom of the barrel. The elegant British gentleman who once poured drinks for the commander-in-chief began filling his empty mansion with a revolving door of low-level drug dealers, sycophants, and B-movie hangers-on. He needed an audience. He needed any audience, no matter how cheap or parasitic, to prove he still existed. He began picking up the tab at bars, buying the temporary, hollow loyalty of strangers, just so he wouldn't have to sit alone with his own thoughts. To fuel this frantic, paranoid lifestyle, his substance abuse transitioned from a reckless habit into a total biological dependency. Alcohol was no longer a social lubricant. It was the baseline required to stop his hands from shaking when he woke up in the afternoon. Cocaine was no longer a party drug used to keep up with Sinatra's grueling hours. It became the central organizing principle of his entire day. He was consuming staggering quantities of narcotics, not to have fun, but trying desperately to chemically recreate the feeling of power and invincibility he had lost. The drug gave him a synthetic spine, a chemical lie that told him he was still important, still a player, still the man who knew everyone's secrets. But Hollywood is a town built entirely on visuals, and the camera is a ruthless, unforgiving prosecutor. As the mid-1960s bled into the 1970s, the physical toll of his self-destruction became impossible to hide behind a tailored suit and a tan. The studios, sensing the stench of failure and recognizing the massive insurance liability of hiring an unpredictable, unhinged addict, slammed their heavy iron gates shut. The man who had starred in sweeping MGM epics, who had charmed audiences in Ocean's 11, was abruptly downgraded. His aristocratic crown was stripped away, and he was thrown into the humiliating low-budget purgatory of television guest appearances. And this is where the physical degradation truly begins to mirror the psychological rot. As the money dried up and the prestige evaporated, Lawford would attempt one final desperate strategy to buy his way back into relevance. If he could no longer be the handsome leading man on the silver screen, he would try to cast himself as the youthful playboy in real life, embarking on a series of bizarre, frantic marriages to women young enough to be his daughters. He was about to turn his private life into a public circus, accelerating his physical decay and hurtling toward a medical nightmare that even the tabloids would find hard to stomach. The depth of Peter Lawford's professional purgatory was glaringly exposed under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a 1970s television studio. If the 1950s were his golden era of tailored tuxedos and studio-manufactured aristocratic grace, and the 1960s were his terrifying cocaine-fueled high-wire act between the White House and the mafia, then the 1970s were the years he hit the pavement. Hollywood is an industry built entirely on the ruthless currency of visual perfection and social leverage. By the dawn of this new decade, Lawford had squandered both. He was no longer a leading man, and he was certainly no longer a political power broker. He was a highly visible liability. The major film studios, well aware of his devastating excommunication by both Frank Sinatra and the Kennedy family, recognized that he possessed no remaining political capital. More practically, they looked at his severe, spiraling narcotic addiction and saw an uninsurable risk. The heavy iron gates of the major lots were locked to him. To survive, the man who had once starred in sweeping Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer epics alongside Elizabeth Taylor was forced into the humiliating low-budget conveyor belt of episodic television. You can track the exact agonizing trajectory of his decline by watching his guest appearances on shows like The Love Boat and Fantasy Island. You must look past the canned laugh tracks and the brightly colored polyester costumes of the era. You must observe the actor himself. The crisp, impossibly handsome jawline that had once captivated millions of moviegoers had completely dissolved into a puffy, bloated mask of retained fluids and alcoholic ruin. The sharp, sparkling eyes that used to charm presidents were now perpetually bloodshot, glassy, and darting around the set with a deeply uncomfortable paranoid anxiety. He was sweating profusely through the heavy television makeup, his body physically struggling to process the massive amounts of toxins he was ingesting daily. Production crews and fellow actors from that specific era routinely traded horrifying, tragic stories about Lawford's behavior on set. He was no longer the consummate British professional of the 1940s. He would frequently arrive hours late for his call times, stumbling out of his assigned dressing room in a thick, impenetrable chemical haze. He was entirely incapable of remembering even the simplest three-word lines of dialogue. The cocaine had severely damaged his short-term memory, and the alcohol had destroyed his equilibrium. Directors operating on tight television schedules were forced to use giant cardboard cue cards held just inches off camera. They had to shoot him in brief, heavily edited, fractured takes just to piece together a remotely coherent performance. He could not hit his marks. He could not stand still without swaying. He was a ghost haunting his own profession, a tragic, hollowed-out shell of a former star being propped up by frustrated camera crews just so he could collect a meager union paycheck to fund his next purchase from a dealer. But the professional humiliation was only the public face of his disintegration. We must judge him on the consequences of his internal void. The loss of his career was devastating, but the psychological terror of his empty house was what truly drove him mad. Peter Lawford suffered from a fatal psychological weakness, an absolute paralyzing inability to be alone. His entire identity, from his isolated childhood in French hotels to his days as the Rat Pack mascot, was predicated on having an audience. He needed someone, anyone, to look at him and confirm that he still existed. With his famous friends gone and his powerful in-laws actively pretending he was dead, Lawford began to purchase his audience. He transformed from an elegant host into a desperate patron of the Los Angeles underbelly. The man who once poured expensive scotch for the commander-in-chief began filling his living room with a revolving door of low-level drug dealers, parasitic sycophants, and opportunistic hangers-on. He would pick up the tab at expensive restaurants, paying for the dinners and drinks of absolute strangers simply to buy their temporary hollow loyalty for the evening. He was hemorrhaging money. The millions of dollars he had earned during the peak years of MGM and the Ocean's 11 era were vaporizing. They were disappearing into a literal cloud of white powder, exorbitant bar tabs, and the staggering legal costs of his divorce from the Kennedy dynasty. To compensate for this devastating loss of professional dignity and social standing, Lawford attempted to forcefully rewrite his own narrative through a series of increasingly bizarre, frantic marriages. If he could no longer be the handsome, youthful leading man on the silver screen, he would try to cast himself as the virile, ageless playboy in his private life. What followed was a grotesque pantomime of romance. These were not marriages born of genuine connection or mutual respect. They were hostage situations for his ego. He was attempting to vampire the youth and vitality of women young enough to be his daughters, hoping their proximity would somehow cure his own rapid decay. In 1971, at the age of 48, he married Mary Rowan. She was 21 years old. She was the daughter of Dan Rowan, the famous comedian and co-host of the incredibly popular television show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Dan Rowan, who was actually a peer and contemporary of Lawford's, was reportedly furious and deeply disgusted by the arrangement. He saw exactly what Lawford was doing. He saw a desperate, decaying addict manipulating a young girl to secure a fresh supply of attention and perhaps tap into a new vein of Hollywood relevance. The wedding photographs from this event are deeply unsettling. You see a young, vibrant woman standing next to a man who looks exhausted, his smile tight and artificial, his eyes completely dead. The arrangement was a spectacular, predictable disaster. It imploded in a chaotic mess of drug-fueled screaming matches and public embarrassments, ending in a bitter divorce after exactly 8 months. Yet, incapable of learning from the wreckage of his own actions, driven by a compulsion he could not control, he repeated the exact same destructive pattern just a few years later. In 1976, at the age of 53, he married Deborah Gould. She was a 25-year-old aspiring actress. This union was even more brief and chaotic than the last. It lasted a mere 2 months before ending in a highly publicized, deeply acrimonious separation. These frantic trips to the altar were the uncoordinated thrashings of a drowning man reaching for any piece of driftwood to keep his head above the dark, freezing water. He was not looking for a wife. He was looking for a caretaker, a nurse, and an audience member who was legally obligated to applaud his fading act. The financial consequences of these desperate maneuvers were absolute. The alimony payments from his rapid-fire divorces, combined with his staggering daily cocaine budget, finally broke the bank. He could no longer maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. The most devastating physical blow to his carefully constructed persona came when he was forced to sell the legendary Santa Monica beachfront mansion. This was not just a piece of real estate. This was his kingdom. This was the house where he had hosted Marilyn Monroe. This was the diplomatic compound where he had brokered deals between the Las Vegas Mafia and the President of the United States. To lose that house was to lose the very last physical monument to his former power. He was forced to downsize to a much smaller, far more anonymous property. He effectively retreated into a self-imposed narcotic exile, hiding from a town that had completely forgotten why he was ever famous in the first place. The men who used to beg him for introductions to the White House, the studio executives who used to send him expensive gifts on his birthday, now actively crossed the street to avoid him. He was a pariah. There is a deeply telling, incredibly sad anecdote from the late 1970s that was whispered among Hollywood veterans of that era. It perfectly encapsulates the horrific reality of his daily existence. A former Metro Goldwyn Mayer executive, a man who had known Lawford during his absolute prime in the 1940s, walked into a dimly lit, relatively empty restaurant on the Sunset Strip. He spotted Lawford sitting entirely alone in a corner booth. The executive approached the table to offer a polite greeting, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Lawford was sitting there, wearing dark sunglasses indoors, trying to hide the ruined state of his eyes. He was holding a glass of liquor, but his hands were trembling so violently that he had to use both of them to bring the rim to his mouth, spilling the amber liquid onto his stained shirt. When Lawford tried to speak, he babbled incoherently. He started talking rapidly about a major film script he was supposedly producing, referencing actors who had been dead for years, completely detached from reality. The executive realized with a profound sense of horror that the man sitting in the booth was no longer Peter Lawford. The personality had been completely eaten away by the chemicals. He quietly walked to the maitre d', paid Lawford's bar tab, and walked out into the sunlight, realizing he had just looked at a dead man who simply hadn't stopped breathing yet. By the end of the 1970s, the psychological rot had fully saturated his physical being. He had spent 3 decades treating his own body as a high-capacity industrial furnace, burning toxic chemicals to fuel the false confidence he needed to survive in the shadow of kings. But no furnace can burn forever without melting its own steel. The trembling hands, the slurred speech, and the incoherent babbling were merely the early warning sirens. Deep inside his abdomen, hidden beneath the cheap television suits, his internal organs were preparing to hand him the final, inescapable bill. The liver and kidneys, pushed far beyond the limits of human biological endurance, were staging a catastrophic revolt. The medical nightmare that was about to unfold behind the closed doors of his downsized home would prove to be far more grotesque, far more agonizing than any social punishment Frank Sinatra or the Kennedy family could have ever devised. By the dawn of the 1980s, decades of excess finally caught up with him. The human body does not recognize political connections or past box office receipts. It only keeps a meticulous biological ledger. His liver, severely damaged by years of chronic substance abuse, began to fail. End-stage cirrhosis set in, transforming his once camera-ready appearance into a stark reflection of his internal struggle. The camera-ready, sharply contoured face that had once smiled from 1,000 movie posters had vanished entirely. Because his liver could no longer process bilirubin, he developed severe jaundice. His skin and the whites of his eyes turned a sickly, unnatural, luminous yellow. As his kidneys began to fail secondary to the liver disease, his body lost the ability to process fluids. He developed massive ascites. Gallons of toxic fluid leaked into his abdominal cavity. His arms and legs, already thin from severe malnutrition and muscle wasting, were attached to a torso that was grotesquely swollen, giving him the agonizing appearance of a starving man who was 9 months pregnant. But the most terrifying consequence of this biological shutdown was neurological. It was the absolute disintegration of his mind. Because his liver could no longer filter the standard everyday toxins from his bloodstream, those poisons bypassed the organ entirely and traveled directly to his brain. This resulted in a condition known as hepatic encephalopathy. Due to hepatic encephalopathy, his mind became increasingly clouded. The elegant conversationalist of the Kennedy era was replaced by a man battling severe confusion and fading motor control. It was a deeply tragic decline. This was not the quiet, dignified fade-out of an elder statesman. It was the agonizing reality of a man losing his physical and mental faculties in an increasingly empty house, far removed from the glamour he once knew. And I call it grotesque because his fatal psychological weakness, his absolute, terrifying, paralyzing inability to be alone, drove him to commit one final spectacular act of self-sabotage. It is July of 1984. Peter Lawford is 60 years old, but biologically, his body is closer to 90. He is dying. Everyone who looks at him knows he is dying. Yet driven by the frantic terror of facing the dark void of death by himself, he decides to get married for the fourth and final time. He marries Patricia Seaton. She is 3 decades his junior. This was not a union forged in the fires of a great sweeping romance. This was a desperate, transactional maneuver by a terrified man. He was not looking for a life partner. He was looking for a hospice nurse with a marriage certificate. He needed an audience member to hold his hand as the curtain came down, someone legally bound to stay in the room when the smell of ammonia became too strong. The tragic, sickening irony of this final marriage is almost too painful to articulate. In his desperate scramble to find anyone to validate his existence at the very end, he legally bound himself to the exact woman who 4 years later would orchestrate his ultimate public humiliation. He married the woman who would refuse to pay his cemetery fees. He married the woman who would invite the tabloid paparazzi to photograph his eviction. He married the woman who would dump his ashes into the Pacific Ocean. He spent his entire life submitting to people who did not care about him, and his final act on earth was to hand the legal rights to his corpse over to a woman who viewed his remains as a financial burden and a tabloid opportunity. Before the final collapse, there was one last desperate attempt at an intervention. In early 1984, recognizing the sheer speed at which he was accelerating toward the grave, a few remaining acquaintances managed to get him admitted to the Betty Ford Center. This was the famous, highly exclusive rehabilitation clinic in the California desert, a place where Hollywood royalty went to dry out and resurrect their careers. But sending Peter Lawford to rehab in 1984 was a fundamentally farcical gesture. You go to a rehabilitation center to learn how to live without drugs. You go to repair your psychological coping mechanisms. But rehab is designed for people whose biological architecture is still somewhat intact. You cannot rehabilitate a dead organ. You cannot use group therapy to cure end-stage cirrhosis. The doctors at Betty Ford took one look at his jaundiced skin, his swollen abdomen, and his compromised neurological state, and they recognized the grim reality. The issue was no longer addiction management. The issue was imminent, irreversible multi-organ failure. Lawford's body was a condemned building, and the structural pillars had already turned to dust. There was nothing left to save. He was discharged from the clinic. He was effectively sent home not to recover, but to wait for the clock to run out. The chemical armor he had worn for 30 years had finally melted permanently into his skin, poisoning him from the inside. He had survived the oppressive, freezing hotels of his childhood. He had survived the suffocating expectations of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio system. He had survived the psychological terror of the Kennedy family's absolute rejection. He had even survived the brutal, career-ending excommunication by Frank Sinatra and the Las Vegas Mafia. He had survived all the ruthless kings and all the dangerous empires. But as the winter of 1984 approached and the cold winds began to blow off the Pacific Ocean toward his Los Angeles home, the terrifying truth became unavoidable. Peter Lawford could not survive the one person he had been running from his entire life. He could not survive himself. The ultimate reckoning had arrived, and there was no one left to call. The phone lines to the White House were dead. The doors to the Sands Hotel were locked, and the ambulance that was about to arrive at his house would not be taking him to a movie premiere, but to a sterile, brightly lit room where the final verdict of his life would be delivered in absolute, deafening silence. The timeline of his final days reads like a grim, inverted echo of his glory years. Throughout the 1950s and the early 1960s, Peter Lawford had lived a life defined by deafening, intoxicating noise. He had spent his prime in rooms packed to the breaking point with the most powerful figures on the planet. His reality was scored by the constant, thrilling soundtrack of clinking heavy crystal martini glasses, the blaring brass of Las Vegas jazz bands, the frantic ringing of secure White House telephone lines, and the roaring, confident laughter of presidents and mobsters. He was a man who existed entirely in the center of the crowd, terrified of the quiet. But when the end finally came in the winter of 1984, the silence was absolute, suffocating, and profound. On December 16, 1984, the ruined, exhausted vessel that had once been the golden boy of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. There were no paparazzi scrambling to get a photograph of his arrival. There were no studio fixers waiting at the emergency room doors to manage the press. He was simply another failing biological organism being processed by the American medical system. He was suffering from a total catastrophic collapse of his liver and kidneys, complicated by a severe internal hemorrhage. The decades of chemical abuse had completely dissolved the internal architecture of his body. He was placed in a sterile, brightly lit intensive care unit, hooked to a terrifying array of monitors, tubes, and artificial life support machines. He lay in that bed for 8 agonizing days. His life's guest list had once been a staggering roster of the famous, wealthy, and powerful whose secrets he had kept. It included the Kennedy clan with their vast generational wealth, Frank Sinatra, powerful studio executives and billionaires who once begged for an invitation to his Santa Monica dining room just to breathe the same air as the commander-in-chief. Not a single one of those titans of industry or politics walked through the heavy double doors of the Cedars-Sinai intensive care unit. The telephone in his hospital room did not ring with urgent, concerned messages from Washington, D.C. or Las Vegas. There were no massive floral arrangements sent from the Senate floor or the Sands Hotel. The men who had used his home as a diplomatic compound, the men who had leveraged his aristocratic charm to soften their own brutal public images, had long since moved on to brighter, unbroken toys. The bill for a lifetime of sycophancy had finally come due, and Peter Lawford was forced to pay it entirely on his own, staring at a sterile ceiling, listening only to the mechanical rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. On December 24th, 1984, Christmas Eve. It is a night traditionally and culturally meant for family, warmth, forgiveness, and belonging. It is the night you gather with the people who anchor you to the world. On this specific night, Peter Lawford's exhausted, battered heart finally gave out. He suffered a massive, fatal cardiac arrest. He was 61 years old, but his body carried the mileage of a man who had lived 100 traumatic lifetimes. He died drowning in millions of dollars of debt, completely stripped of his professional dignity, and entirely brutally estranged from the massive power structures that had defined his very existence. When the flatline tone finally sounded on the cardiac monitor, it did not mark the passing of a king. It marked the expiration of a deeply compromised asset. The shattered mosaic of his life leaves behind a chilling legacy. Peter Lawford was systematically trained by alpha predators to believe his only value lay in reflecting their glory. He operated as a silent vault for the massive egos of dangerous men, proving that trading autonomy for a rented seat at someone else's table does not yield power. It simply turns a man into a disposable human shield. Had he possessed the courage to stand independently, history might have remembered a capable, beloved artist. Instead, he willingly surrendered his sovereignty, becoming a tragic, cautionary tale of self-erasure, which brings us back, inevitably and tragically, to the sound of that marble slab being pried from the wall at Westwood Village Memorial Park. It is 1988, 4 years after his lonely death in the hospital. The final insult is being meticulously executed. The ashes are removed from the niche because no one, not the Kennedy Trust, not his former Hollywood colleagues, not his children, cares enough to pay the outstanding invoice of $10,000. The widow, Patricia Seaton, poses for the flashing cameras of the National Enquirer, holding the plastic container of his remains, monetizing the absolute rock bottom of his dignity. This eviction is the perfect, inescapable metaphor for Peter Lawford's entire existence. He never owned a single inch of his own life. He rented space in the Kennedy dynasty. He rented space on Frank Sinatra's stage. He rented space in the Hollywood studio system, but rented power always comes with an eviction notice. The moment he could no longer pour the drinks, facilitate the dirty secrets, or provide the glamorous cover, his lease on relevance was terminated. The widow leaves the cemetery with the cameras trailing behind her. They drive to the edge of the continent, boarding a small boat that heads out into the vast, churning expanse of the Pacific Ocean. She opens the container and scatters the ashes into the cold, gray water. The Pacific Ocean is vast and entirely indifferent to the constructs of human ambition. It does not recognize the difference between a Hollywood superstar, a presidential brother-in-law, or a man who died alone in an intensive care unit. As Lawford's ashes hit the surface, they lingered for only a brief moment before disappearing into the dark currents. The dark currents quickly absorbed his ashes, erasing the last physical trace of a man who had spent his life reflecting the glory of others. And as the boat turns back toward the glittering, deceptive lights of Los Angeles, the world simply keeps turning, completely and utterly unbothered by the absolute, terrifying silence he left behind.